That's all I saw.
Okay. So I was at Gateway to Space a couple of years ago, and Bryce came in, hadn't met him yet, and somebody says, there's this new guy over here. I think he studied computer science. So maybe you could go over and talk to him and introduce him to some of the people that studied computer science. And so I go over and talk to him, and I've only got a minute or so, and I learned, well, yeah, he's got a master's degree in computer science, so he knows a little bit of computer science. And then, you know, we had to get started, you know how the schedules are here. And then we had one of these morning breaks like we had today. And I walked by, and he's got a bunch of engineers gathered around him. And so I go up to find out what's going on, and I find out, oh yeah, he went to University of Missouri-Rolla. He's got an aerospace engineering degree. Like, oh, I guess I categorized him too quick. And so then we go to lunch, and we get back from lunch, and there's a bunch of people standing around him talking about biology. And, oh yeah, he happens to have a master's degree in biology too. So I'm like, well, I got to keep an eye on this guy. So we were able to entice him to participate a little bit more. And we were planning to have an event over at Earth Day. And we're like, darn, we got to reach all ages, we got to reach children. What are we going to have on our table? And he says, oh, well, I can bring some of the children's books I wrote. Oh, okay. Which points out you can go out to Amazon, to Amazon Smile, and it was pointed out to me that we don't search for St. Louis Space Frontier, we search for National Space Society, and then they've got a bunch of cities listed, and you pick St. Louis. But anyway, you can go out there if you know some young people that should learn some science. There's children's books out there. That's amazing. And then we've been doing events over at Venture Cafe every month, and so we're trying to figure out who can, you know, relate to some of these people that have got startup businesses and whatnot. And so once again, Bryce speaks up. He says, "Oh, I've got a startup business, Cyan React." And we're like, "Wow, okay." So, and then what do you do for a living? Oh, so I have to look at this one. So he's a senior engineer, technical staff at Software Engineering Institute, MapTest, managing partner. I mean, I could go on and on and on. My talk of introducing him would take longer than what we've got. So I'm going to stop. And you can see, so you've got a multidisciplinary approach here to space farming, menus, and biological support. So please welcome Bryce.
I hope I live up to my billing. Okay, so my slides don't have half as much technical detail as you saw the previous presenters present. So if I assumed you wanted more technical detail, we can talk about that stuff later. But I'm glad they talked about resource utilization and places to find water and carbon, because I'm greedy for all of those things. I'm going to talk about how to farm in space, surviving using biological life support. And I'm going to talk about menus and things like that, things you can eat in space. Right? So, I mean, that's near and dear to my heart. What I eat for dinner is always important, right? So, let's see. What is it, a page down here?
Right button.
Oh, that's how you have it set up.
Right button.
Oh, sorry.
On the keyboard, the right arrow.
The right arrow?
Hang on. I should know this. I have a computer science stuff, right? I'm going to talk about a little thing called mass and energy cycles on Earth, life support for space farming, and dinner from glop to gourmet. So anybody who's read Andy Weir's latest book, Artemis, talks about glop and the fact it's made out of algae. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk first about a farm. So if you, wow, it got digested a lot. Anyhow, It's a much prettier picture online if you happen to download this prezo, and I'll put everything up online for you. In fact, I have a site called spacefarms.info, and you can find all my goodies up there. In fact, all the highly technical stuff. You can drive yourself nuts. On Earth, we get a lot of stuff for free, and if you look in the background, that happens to be a soybean field from Illinois, in case you're curious. We have omnivorous animals, people and their favorite puppies, so big fan of those. You also have plants, obviously, like the soybeans in the background. What you don't see, so let's say this were a regular normal farm, a full-sized farm that you'd have with a pond that you were growing some aquatic crop in. You have your plants that you're growing too, right? So if you're doing this all on Earth, you could have a pond full of herbivores like tilapia or shrimp, like down in southern Missouri, down towards New Madrid. Right, so those you don't know, we actually grow shrimp in Missouri in both outdoors and indoor environments. So down towards New Madrid, they actually grow shrimp outdoors. So you would have a pond. You'd have algae that grows in the pond, which shrimp love to eat, and so do tilapia, and so do a lot of other herbivores, including our famous jumping carp, the silver carp that's in the river. It is a big fan of algae. On the bottom of that pond and in any healthy soil is actually a whole biome of different things. It's a biome of different funguses, mycorrhizae being an example. You have rhizomal bacteria, so root bacteria that also live in the soil. And it's a whole biome of things that decompose things in the dirt. So, right, you might have some bugs down there, you'll have some worms. And you'll notice that there's a whole flow of mass that goes through here. So you have carbon dioxide flowing to the algae and to the plants. You have a harvest that goes back up to the people. You have waste from the people that get decomposed, maybe in a septic tank or a pond that goes out to a leach field that again fertilizes the soil. Right? So you have this whole cycle that happens, and everything, all the energy at one point or another is really provided by the sun. Some of it may be from fossil fuels that you're running in your tractor to get things going. So what I'm proposing for my space farm is I want you to remember this environment, because this is sort of what you have to duplicate in space. So I get a lot of stuff for free. So in the atmosphere, I get carbon dioxide, I get nitrogen, and I get oxygen from the air. So you would think, why oxygen for plants? Well, all those nice things you saw in the dirt are all aerobic organisms for the most part. You have minerals in the soil. You have water from tons of different places, including rain or well water. You have light from photosynthesis from the sun, so I don't have to get it artificially. I get free sunlight, right? Tons of it, hundreds of watts. I think it's 100 kilowatts per hectare or something along those lines. Heating and cooling in the air. If you have an organic field, you have the whole soil biome that makes things wonderful, right? Makes all the things in the soil great so you can grow plants. For example, my grandpa, who never used artificial fertilizers, used manure, and that happened to be a great way of growing things because he relied on that soil biome. In the ponds, you have algae and water plants. And if you have a sewage treatment or septic tank that uses oxygen, you know, you probably have a bubbler that goes on in the septic tank or in a sewer treatment plant that eventually aerates out all those materials and turns them into something the plants can use. So these are all freebies. You farm on Earth, you get this. Oh, I think I went too far. I really wanted to go to this slide, and now go back to the other one. Sorry, I accidentally flipped them out of order. So unfortunately in space, nothing is free. Everything has to be paid for somehow or other, whether it's paid for by lifting mass or paid for by ripping it out of the dirt, right? So getting mass to space settlement is expensive. In situ mass costs the energy to harvest it and convert it, and as we heard earlier, you have to go over a lot of surface area on the moon to get carbon, right? You have to comb a lot of surface to get carbon. Volume is enclosed at a premium, and this is math for the observer. So a cubic meter requires at least 4.8 square meters to enclose it. You can figure it out yourself. You draw a sphere and take the surface area of a sphere. If it's 1 centimeter thick, that means you have to get 130 kilograms of aluminum skin to enclose it. So if you have a cubic meter this big, 130 kilos, right? I could have done the math wrong. I might be off by an order of magnitude, but you get the point. In early stage settlement, soil is not really available, or it takes too much room, so plants are going to be grown without soil. So there's a big argument in the space community right now of whether you're going to start off with some kind of aeroponic or hydroponic system and then go to soil, or just go straight to soil. So there's tons of people who are actually doing work inoculating the regolith and making it that same kind of soil biome. In my personal experience, I think that's something we will do later because of the size it takes to grow things in dirt, right? Just because you can't stack things all together. So wastes, including cellulose from feces and inedible parts of plants, have to be converted to carbon dioxide, water, and nutrients. Something I was mentioning earlier and why I was cringing when they're talking about taking my cellulose and converting it into some kind of carbon powder is because honestly, in a cycling system, if you don't take the cellulose and release the carbon dioxide in it back into the system, eventually all the carbon gets locked up in cellulose, period. And one of the hard things about people that you need to know is you do not exhale enough carbon out of your breath to feed yourself. You don't. So what happens on Earth is when you poop it out, it gets released back into the air over time using those bacteria and funguses. So eventually they release all that cellulose back into carbon dioxide. Eventually the plants take it back in, it goes back into you again. Right? So there's a complete cycle there. So in space, if you didn't do anything with that cellulose, all your carbon would end up in that cellulose, all the mass would, and you'd die. So everything people need should be efficiently recycled from waste to minimize mass inputs in a way that minimizes volume or footprint. So since I don't want to have to enclose everything, I need a smaller volume. I want to go back to this slide. So this is one where I'd walk up there and poke at everything if I could. But let's see, do I get a laser on here?
Yes.
Which button is it? Oh, beautiful. So what I've done is I've created my own little category of different types of resorts and settlements. So right now, if you're going up to Everest Base Camp, that's a zero kind of resort and a zero kind of settlement, meaning it's austere no matter what you do. You ain't going to live at Everest Base Camp, right? You're going to have stuff brought up. You're going to hopefully take some of your stuff with you when you're done, right? And you're not going to raise a family up there, right? You're just going there, getting something done, getting away, right? Oil rig in Antarctica is sort of about the same way, right? It's not a resort either. You might recycle some of what happens up there, and one of my buddies out at Arizona State University actually has made it so they get fresh vegetables in Antarctica. But other than that, almost everything's brought in and hauled back out again. So really you start getting down to this early space, and this is probably what Bigelow has in mind for the first set of space resorts. There's a couple of companies out there doing this right now, right? They're thinking about just putting up something where you can say you've been up to the 100-mile high club. You're going to eventually get to something that's a lot more like a hotel with amenities. So if you go over and stay at the Holiday Inn, or you go stay at the casino resort, whatever, it's going to be something that is a little bit more like, you know, most of the stuff comes from Earth, some of it's local, and in the space sense, you would actually start recycling some of your stuff, right? And you'll notice that it keeps going down this full spectrum till you get to the point where it's sort of like you go to a resort in Costa Rica, where the people who live and work there actually live at the resort location, and then tourists just come in and out, right? And so the stuff that feeds the local people is fully cycled in the space tents. And for the tourists, they bring mass with them, but you know, they might bring some mass with them when they come up, but then they're going to probably take some mass with them when they leave. Right? So mostly, these bottom ones are going to be ones where the mass is mostly completely recycled. And you're going to get a diversity of crops starting up at the middle level and working your way down. So you start getting more interesting menus and things that are actually things you want to actually eat. So space farms must replace all those mass cycles you saw on Earth. So I pointed out the fact that you had the mass going from the air, you know, into the different organisms. The organisms break down the cellulose, release the carbon dioxide, goes back into the plants, goes back around to the people, and you get the idea, right? So everything that's released is reused. So what the concept I've proposed is I break things into what I call stages. So I call one the hydroponic stage, and it's not necessarily strictly hydroponics. It could be an aeroponic, where you have soil and you have like a tube with vapor in it for the roots. It could be something where you have a media, like a diaper, or maybe some kind of media in a gravity environment. And that's similar to what's down in my little prototype hydroponic thing down here, where I've actually got gravel and water running through there. So you could do the same thing on the moon, where you've rounded off the pebbles and you run water through there, and you've inoculated that media with bacteria and funguses so that the plants grow better. It could be like that. It could be a couple different ways, and eventually you could end up with soil, but I don't think you're going to be there right away. I mean, you could just use a sleeve to start with, eventually get media, and then maybe later on go with soil. So that's one type of stage. Another type is what I call the aquatic stage, and that's where you get, oh, there it is, where you get fish or shrimp. So personally, I'm a carnivore, I'll admit it. A lot of people who are probably going to tourist up to the station probably are also going to be carnivores. They'll probably admit it too. Okay, enough of the laser. Anyhow, so you'll have tanks. In this context, you're going to have tanks to grow fish or shrimp or other aquatic organisms, animals that you want to eat. Another stage below that is called the algae reactor stage. So a bioreactor is essentially a biological machine, a machine that allows biology to do biochemical processes. So in one kind of bioreactor, there's free open bioreactor where you see bubblers go through and you see this green glop flopping up and down inside the bioreactor. That's an open space bioreactor. For algae, it'll be a photobioreactor because you'll have lights shining in on it, and it'll cause photosynthesis to occur. So CO2 will be bubbled into it. Out of it comes oxygen, right? And the carbon's captured by the organisms themselves in an irreversible process. And they end up with more cells that you can pull out and eat. Or you can feed to something else. So that's the algae, I call it the algae reactor, algae bioreactor, or you can call it yourself a photobioreactor, whatever methodology you want to use. A big green tube. The other side is the yeast bacterial bioreactor stage. So remember I told you the soil is alive? And things happen like between that and septic tanks that actually break down cellulose and other types of waste so that they're available to plants for use. That is the yeast bacteria bioreactor stage. Now you could theoretically just burn it, right? Which could release all kinds of gases, including the carbon dioxide you want, and that's been proposed in the past. I propose a more biological method because honestly we already do it on Earth, right? We have septic tank systems, we have sewer treatment plants, and we already have an extensive use of bioreactors in the chemical engineering industry to produce pharmaceuticals and a wide variety of bioactive compounds. This is nothing new. In this case, I would recommend you use a membrane-reacted system where you have some kind of biologically philic active membrane where you fasten the yeast and bacteria against those membranes so you can control the outputs. This already happens in the brewing industry in Europe and in a couple other places, and it allows you to make the bioreactor very small. I'd propose you do the same thing for algae at some point too. So it doesn't have to be. You could use a free space to start with, but eventually you probably want to use some kind of membrane system as well. And that's sort of what my other companies started working on. But anyhow, these are the 4 stages I have. So remember, hydroponic, aquatic, algae reactor, yeast bacteria bioreactor. The hydroponic stage, and this is utterly notional, and it probably is maybe not even totally realistic. And I assume that you had some kind of media down here. You have lighting at the top. You have some kind of thing that comes in, and outside this, you're probably going to have a tank where you're going to have buffering between the inside and outside to make sure the mass flows efficiently. But you'll notice there's a ton of different machinery that happens below here, right? So you'll notice there's pumps, there's sensors, there's UV sterilizers, there's reverse osmosis membrane, and other material like that. So there's a wide variety of machines that are going to be energy consumers, and I'm going to get to that later. The idea is that the plants grow in a really happy environment. It's closed off, and I would recommend that it's CO2 rich, possibly to the point where humans don't want to breathe it. So if people go into work the crops, they're going to wear a mask, or you're going to do some kind of robotic tending, or both. And the reason I would do that, and then I would also oxygenate the roots, is to vastly accelerate the productivity of those plants. So if you both oxygenate the roots, because you have that active biome, remember, in the root system, and then you CO2 enrich the top with the perfect lighting, and the lighting doesn't have to come from just above, it can come around it too. Then you could grow plants in a small environment and get a high productivity output. So this algae photobioreactor thing, the green tubes, like I said, which is actually in this notional drawing is a tube of tubes of tubes with LEDs embedded inside. And you'll notice there's another buffer tank out the front. I actually put it here. And the idea is that you'd produce algae sludge. Now, if it's membrane confined, you would use pulsing of the tanks to push the algae chunks out the back, and then you could send them onto your aquatic stage to feed your aquatic animals, like your carp or tilapia or whatever, right? Or even the people. You could dry it out and eat it. So the purpose of this stage is really to capture carbon and turn it into more algae. So that's the primary purpose. If you pull the algae sludge out, part of the interesting part is you're going to have to dehydrate it at some point to recover that water and send it back into the system, just because algae is 9/10 water. So at some point, you're going to even if you want to have humans eat it, you're going to have to pull a lot of that water out before you feed it to people, and you're going to have to send it back into this process. So you'll notice, again, a lot of machinery in here. You'll see some gas separation that occurs along here.
We're about 15 minutes to go.
Thank you. Aquatic stage is the tank stage. Fish and other animals, including shrimp, orient for two things. So even if there's no gravity, and this was found out in the Apollo missions, and this has been done on the ISS too, fish orient due to current and light. So they face up like this. They orient towards light being above them, and they orient towards current being in their nose. And so as a result, if you pack them into something like this, it's called a raceway. So if you go to a fish hatchery, like down in Branson, you'll see the Shepherd of the Hills Fish Hatchery, for example. Or if you go to some of the tilapia growing operations in the area where they don't use round tanks and maybe some of them use raceways, most of them use round tanks. You could use a round tank here too. The idea is you'll see all the fish pointed into the current. So you'll notice this also has big buffer tanks on it. You'll notice there's recirculation that happens. You'll notice that the current orients the fish. And you're not going to have just one tank. So something I've found out in my prior research is I came up with a thing called a large-scale growth model. And the idea is there's a coefficient that tells me how many extra things I need when I grow something. So one of the things about a space farm is you have to arrange for continuous harvests. So on Earth you have seasonal harvest, right? So every fall we pull everything out of the ground. Winter comes, everything dies. You replant in the spring and start over again, right? Except for winter wheat, which may be a harvest in the summer. In this case, what you have to do is you have to have enough organisms that you can pull something out every day. So that you always have something maturing every day, and you're always putting something in every day. So that's called continuous harvest. And in order for the mathematical version of this, which I put out on my papers that you can pull down line on your own time, you'll see that there's a mathematical version that tells me how much tank space I need for the fish and shrimp, how much extra room I need for the hydroponic garden, for example. Luckily for algae and yeast and bacteria, they grow so fast, I really don't have to worry about it much. But this is for the aquatic stage, so I can have my fish and shrimp. This is a very notional version of the yeast bacteria membrane bioreactor. It is an extremely complicated thing. Monsanto makes a lot of money, and so does Emerson making these things. So they have complicated designs for these in the real world, and it would be far more complex than depicted. The idea is you'll have multiple kinds of tanks. You'll have some kind of buffer tank up front that you'll settle things out of. And then you'll have other membrane-mediated tanks in the middle, and then on the far side you'll have enough buffer tank. The idea is this is the Swiss Army knife of the space farm. It makes all the biochemistry balance. So in early versions of the farm, it might be less aerobic and more yeast producing or more bacteria material producing. And in later farms, it will become an aerobic machine that just cracks cellulose to release carbon dioxide and water. So the key farm cycles, if you want to look at the closer version, it's over on that same chart way over there on the paper form up front. The idea is that there are a bunch of different cycles that happen in the farm, and you'll need complicated systems that run between all the different types of stages. Some of the key things you'll notice are the key chemical processes, and I've already mentioned them. Cracking cellulose for carbon dioxide and water is one of them. Obviously, humans produce waste and CO2, same with animals. And there's other waste that you add energy to release other nutrients that are for plants, so that the plants can absorb the nutrients to the roots. This isn't really a biochemical paper, otherwise I would actually go into all the pain on that. But again, some of it's on that paper chart if you want to take a peek later. My research to date has used models largely. I've used a combination, and it's a really abused version of a genetic algorithm. If being a computer scientist, even saying it makes me quake a little bit, because it's not really a good computer algorithm, and it's not a genetic algorithm, and it's not really a good Monte Carlo, but it's somewhere in between. So essentially what I've done is modeled a whole swath of species, 14 species to date. And as a result, I've added that growth thing that I modeled in there. I've modeled their complete biochemistry, their output of all the different chemicals that they produce as they go through the whole process of growth. And over a year, how much material is produced, how much edible material is produced, calories, human nutrients, and all of those things wrapped into that model. So the model's evolved over the past 3 to 4 years. Bottom line, as I said before, humans do not exhale enough CO2 to feed themselves, and the yeast bacterial bioreactor stage and aquatic stage must produce CO2 for plants and algae. An interesting side effect of having an aquatic stage is even if you don't eat the fish or shrimp, they help make your farm smaller because they produce the kind of materials you need to make your plants grow better. Right? They create CO2 and they release nutrients that your plants can absorb. So that's why you'll hear a lot of terms about aquaponics. Even if you don't eat the tilapia, you still grow more tomatoes in a smaller space as a result of having the tilapia. Something to think about. So me, I like to eat them. Oh, that's just the way it is. Nutrient balancing of the farm size drives at least one animal species, like I just said. Most of the energy in the farm, this is a paper that is coming out 2 weeks from now officially. So 2 weeks from now, I'll put it out on my website. You can actually look at the math yourself. So I've done some detailed analysis. And it turns out that almost all the energy in the farm, so of the energy consumption in the farm that's required between the 20 kilowatts per person to the 600 kilowatts per person in the case of a large-scale food factory. So that's a pretty big chunk of power. I know, I'm seeing their eyes pop wide open. It's because you're moving around fluids. So some of the fluids, it's not just moving between stages, but that's the recirculation of the fluids inside of the stages. So for example, in a greenhouse, you turn over all the air in a greenhouse dozens of times a day. And that air has a lot of mass. So even on Earth, even in a vertical farm down the road here, you are moving a lot of fluids around. The same thing happens for the root bed, and if you add aquatic animals in there, you have to rotate the water inside of the tank, whether it's a round tank or whether it's a raceway, you're using energy to do that. You're stirring things up. The other side is all those bioreactors, guess what? They have to be recirculated too. So whether it's an algae bioreactor or whether it's that yeast bacterial bioreactor monster, you're taking energy to move fluid around, mostly liquids, and a lot of it being recirculated. So that is your biggest energy consumer. And it will drive the size of your farm. So the size of your farm might be 4 or 5 hectares, up to maybe 6, 7 hectares. And I don't have the numbers right up here, but I can look them up for you if you ask. The solar array, using the Dawn data from NASA Dawn spacecraft for its solar array, is usually somewhere between 3 to 6 times the size of the farm's footprint. So even if you stack the hydroponic beds 3 high, 6 times bigger. Something to think about. So if you come up with a better efficient pump, you're doing a real good job for us. Those are kind of scenarios I've used to date. So I had 6 scenarios I've run every time so far. These are the species I've used. So barley, bell peppers, chlorella is one of the single-celled algae. It's green algae. There's a whole book out there, by the way, if you want to look up algae burgers. That's a good, interesting book to look up. Pinto beans, potatoes, rice, shrimp. Shrimp being Pacific whitelegs or prawns. Either one works for this. Silver carp, and I've done quite a bit of my own research to figure out how silver carp would work in this. If you're curious, I can tell you all about the famous jumping carp. Soybeans, spirulina, tilapia, tomatoes, of course, and finally the yeast bacterial bioreactor. So you notice that all the way off to the far right, scenarios 3 and 4 are the ones with the most diverse chow. That's where you're getting the most diverse food. And scenario 4 is a full food factory. So it will take in, the way I modeled it is it'll take in, I think it's 50 kilograms per person, and it will sell out 50 kilograms of food per person. So the idea is that if you have 100 people living there, you're getting rid of 5,000 kilos worth of food in a day, right? So it's a food factory. I make some assumptions about spices. So I'm assuming when you first set up your space farm, you just don't have time, right? You're just getting started. And I'm assuming a big thing about this, people like to see greenery where they live. They just like to see plants. They like the smell of plants. They like to see them. It makes them happier in general, releases ions in the air, wonderful transpiration effects. Overall, plants are great. So I'm assuming that in the habitat, you take a little bit of your gray water, and not the black water that comes out of the flusher, but the part that goes through when you wash your hands or you process, that kind of stuff. The gray water, you're going to use organic soaps and everything, so I can recycle with it. And part of that gray water goes to growing spice plants. So in the corner of your little cubicle or along the wall of the tube that you live in, you're going to be growing spice plants. And the reason you're going to do that is so your food tastes a whole lot better. And so if you notice, there's a bunch of spices you can grow right away in very small places in hydroponic context. In fact, all of these can be grown hydroponically, theoretically, for the bottom 3. The other ones have all been proven. So people have grown all those other things hydroponically.
Just the beer, coffee, tea still.
Yeah, I like my coffee and I like my tea. I think that would actually, by the way, be a wonderful luxury export. So would beer, by the way. Scenario 1. So that scenario 1 is an initial settlement, very early in the spectrum. You pretty much have just bioreactors. That's it. So you can take some of the yeast, so you can pump out some yeast solids, and you can take some algae and make bars, cakes, and protein drinks. Yeah. You can ferment algae using yeast to make some kind of algae wine kombucha thing. At least you'll feel better. You can make soups using algae strips and powders as a base, yeast clumps for protein, and dried yeast as flavoring. And hopefully you got some of those spices going after a couple months, so at least you have something to spice it with. You can also turn algae films into a salad, and you could get fancy with some chemistry to extract some sugars, oils, proteins. So you can turn algae into like a Swiss Army knife of biomaterials, and if given enough energy, you can cheat. And you can use enzymes to break it down into a bunch of stuff. Right? So you can make a bunch of artificial everything, and if you had to survive, you could. I'm not saying it would be a wonderful existence. It's not dietarily wonderful. You can use algae jelly and 3D print interesting things like waffles and gummies, but... Sorry. Okay. 1B, same thing with tomato. So you have tomato salads. You can ferment tomatoes to get wine and vinegar. Vinegar opens up a lot of recipe options, so remember, you like vinegar. It's You can make noodles from yeast and algae powders, and now you can make some sauces and a marinara. So you can make some meatballs from yeast, you can use some of your spices and make a little bit of spaghetti, sort of like a pseudo spaghetti. So next scenario is developing, more sustained. So this one actually has a pretty large hydroponic garden and a teeny little bit of tilapia. So you can make everything before, but now we can ferment and distill potatoes to get vodka. At this stage is the first time you actually get a Bloody Mary. So that's for my wife's benefit. Potatoes can be turned into sweeteners. So actually, with the addition of amylase in particular, and this is going to gross you out a little bit, but salivary amylase works for this. Don't have to be your spit. But amylase can use it to make a sweetener. So now we have a sweetener. Potato can be used for breads. You can make a wide variety of Mexican and Asian foods. So less than a little teeny bit of fish, you can make some peppers, beans, and bam, I got a little bit of Mexican food. And some Asian food maybe. Tilapia fillets, you only have a few tilapia. You can take the leftover parts of the tilapia, and this, for those who are not of Asian, who eat Asian cuisines, this might freak you out a little bit, but I like Thai food, and so I'm familiar with fish sauce. You need to ferment out the fish parts to get the fish sauce. Same thing, but now in this version, so scenario 2B is the first scenario in my group that has a grain, rice being the grain, and now rice opens up everything. So before you had some pseudo noodles and you had some pseudo things, right? You had some leftover greens maybe, you had a couple vegetables. This one now, with rice, opens up a lot of stuff. So horchata, you can make sake. You can use ginger to work as a bittering agent for beer, because at this stage you should have ginger. Concentrated rice and potatoes can be made to sweeteners again. And rice also allows the expansion into rice-based cuisines, pilafs, and bread. So the first time you get muffins is right about here. And you can use potato breading and things for panko crust for your seafood. 3 and 4 are the ones where you get the whole 9 yards. So all those lists of species you saw, you finally get a full diversity. And I've added soybeans at these last 2 scenarios because soybeans are hard to grow. So you put them in the soil, they grow great. You put them in hydroponics, they're much harder to get to work right. So they're nitrogen intensive crops. So that's why they only appear in the last 2 of my scenarios. So I have barley too. I've added barley as well. So barley, finally, real beer. Very important. You also get malt. So the thing about malt is malt has the critical enzymes required to break starches into sugars. So instead of using amylase or something weird like that, I can finally actually use a regular malt to do what what happens over at Anheuser-Busch over here. So at Anheuser-Busch, they make a malt. They take the malt, grind it up, mix it with the grain. The two of them together extracts the sugars. You add the yeast, you get beer, right? You add hops and get beer. This is finally the time frame, by the way, when you have hops and you can make a real beer, which would be a great export crop. So you can make beer, sell that beer product to somewhere, and it's probably going to be the ultimate microbrew. You can also, by the way, somebody would ask me before how the heck you would ferment in space. I don't know why they've messed this up already to date. Honestly, you can confine the yeast to a membrane and use a circulator, and then they would finally get the wine and beer they're trying to make on the ISS, but nobody's listened to me yet. I asked them about it before at ISTC. We'll see what happens. So soybeans add tofu, edamame, soy sauce, and sprouts. Soy sauce is very important for most Asian cuisines. And by the way, now you can actually make sushi. Tilapia sushi, but it's sushi, right? You can also make donuts, French fries, since you have soy oil. Soy is a great source of oils, which opens up a lot of cuisine options. So before, I sort of had to do some tricks to get oils. With soybeans, I've now got an oil crop. Got tons of oil, all I want. I can do all kinds of cool things with the oils. I can also make lotions because your hands are probably going to get dry inside the space station, for example. Just saying. Assume the settlement has a few years, so now is the time where you start thinking about, hey, maybe you want to take some of my hydroponic capability and start growing coffees and teas. So you need a lot of room for coffee and tea, and it takes 2 to 3 years to mature a coffee or a tea bush before you get anything. But once you do it, again, one of the ultimate exports. So you think Jamaica Blue Moon coffee is expensive, try making moon coffee and selling that, right? So as I said before, there's a paper that'll come out in 2 weeks. That will be the hardcore technical stuff like that I have. And on my spacefarm.info page has all my technical stuff for you to download to your heart's content. And you'll find equations and exactly how I did this magical, wonderful mumbo jumbo. I'm going to eventually expand to bioreactors and hydroponic growth. My wife can tell you the basement is loaded with all kinds of weird experiments that I have down there. And some of them are in the kitchen, unfortunately, too. I'm going to refine my models using better data. So as I get better data from different sources, including some of our cooperative groups that we've talked to at Venture Cafe, when I get that better data, my models will incorporate it, and I'll get some better calculate. I also want to start making some scale closed cycle farms. I've been working with Al Globus and other people to do so. So we're trying to find the first place where we're going to use a full closed cycle farm using the bioreactors that add that extra little piece instead of just the hydroponics that you see everywhere. So a lot of people with a lot of different stuff have always left out the bioreactor side of this, and in fact it's messed up. What was it, the biosphere people got hosed up because they didn't calculate for it, right? The bacterial response. So if you have a bioreactor, you can make the Swiss Army knife machine that helps you counterbalance all the biochemistry and actually makes it work. So we're going to try to do a scale farm at some point. And I would like to, and in fact I have, so my Cyan React side does some of the key machinery, including some of the bioreactors, and I've also been working on some of the weirder pumps that have to be made and some of the odder types of machinery that's going to have to be plugged together to make this whole thing work. So that's my future work. Thank you for coming. And why do we settle space? My favorite saying, because it's mine. Trillions of happy, smiling babies. The only way to get trillions of babies is they live on more places than just Earth. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. So when Bryce was talking about how much he enjoyed eating fish, I forgot that earlier I was supposed to mention his combat fishing website, too.
Yes, I fish.
He's everywhere. Yes, sir.
I had one question. How do you handle disease in farms?
Okay, so in earth farms, obviously you isolate, and in space you'll have to do the same thing. So you'll actually have to, even for the hydroponic crops, you can't grow them all in one big enclosure because of that very thing. So you have to actually isolate different sections in the assumption that if a disease wipes out the whole thing, you don't kill everyone and you can restock from the other part. That's also part of my growth model, assuming that you have to have extra chunks because of mortality for either the animals or the plants. But that's a good question.
Next question.
Back.
Let me bring the mic over
Two questions. First, you talk about separating into multiple sites. What do you have to do as far as cleanliness if you go from one site to the other? You're going to have some kind of spray down or blower to...
I'm assuming you would have to, yes, if you're going to bring between sites. But you don't want it too clean. So what I've heard from Doug Plata, who's a medical doctor in our group. So he's a medical doctor in our group in one of our space colonization tech committee in AIAA. And what he told me is actually you want to be able to get sick every so often, the human side. So it's the same thing with the animals. If the animals are totally healthy, they actually won't grow right. You can't grow them in a totally sterile environment. So even in the hydroponic place, or not just in the hydroponic place, but even in the tanks, I'm going to have surface areas along the tanks where I can actually have bacteria colonize. And anybody who's set up an aquarium can tell you this. If you just put gravel in an aquarium and don't let it get inoculated with the bacteria, your fish will die.
Follow up back here.
So my second question was, what kind of crops would you need to grow or could you grow that would enable you to generate lots of alcohol, aka moonshine?
Well, as we know, moonshine is made from corn. And corn is extremely hard to grow in the hydroponic garden for one huge reason is because it's tall. So like with tree crops, and you notice you didn't see any tree crops while we were talking. Now there is a way to get fruits. So there's a trick. And the trick is you take the branch off the fruiting tree and you add an artificial xylem and phloem to it, right? And so then you can get some of the fruit crops. But for corn, a little tall. But Anheuser-Busch makes beer out of rice, and you could definitely make something potent out of rice other than just sake. I mean, you could distill anything and make some good hooch, I'm telling you, right?
I think Sally was next.
So you were talking about bacteria, but also in some instances, parasites are essential too as well.
Well,
or at least the immune system to be able to fight things.
So Morgan Irons has a company that actually works on inoculating regolith and Mars simulant in order to make artificial dirt, right? And she has that same presumption, and so she actually adds annelids or worms to the pile. Now, if you go to a soil farm, you could do that, but if I tried to put worms in that circulating water, I'd kill them. So if I could find the right kind of parasite, yes. I mean, if I could find the right nematode or the right worm or the right insects, maybe, like on the bottom of my fish tanks, I could probably put scuds down there, for example, other amphipods or isopods. And if I designed the filter right, I wouldn't suck them up, and the carp probably wouldn't eat them, the tilapia would, and the shrimp would definitely kill them all. But you could do that, right? You could use amphipods or isopods, for example, if it's an aquatic environment, and that's possible too. You might have to add some kind of a very low level light for them to survive. Or maybe not. I mean, sow bugs don't like light, right? So yeah, so it's possible that adding isopods or amphipods to the root biome probably might have some beneficial effects. Yes, I don't know. I've never done the experiment, but it's possible.
And one from Colleen.
Okay, this is more of a comment than a question, but along with the beer making, you can make beer out of crabgrass grains, along with making flour out of them too, and they grow short. So,
oh yeah, you could. I mean, you could actually brew the algae itself, like I said before. And kombucha is sort of like a weak form of that. They use it with tea and a little algae, but you could do it straight with the algae. You can actually ferment algae itself. Anything with sugars in it can be fermented.
Anything with sugars.
Right, can be fermented, and you can distill it and get some moonshine, and you could be happy, I guess. You could also grow other kinds of crops in the farm. That is where a lot of research has gone into, right? I'm not saying that's a good thing, because I'm worried about how I eat, right? I'll let that to the California and Colorado people. But courtesy of all that effort, I've actually gotten a lot of good sensor research from them. So they actually sense all the way down to the individual plant level, and you will need those kind of sensors in this kind of farm, because you care about every single thing that grows in there, right? So you're going to need a high sensor array and some computing processing power to make sure you can track everything and make sure that everything's flowing exactly the way it needs, and you track down things like disease right off the bat. Right? So you need to monitor everything to make sure everything's tuned just right, because you don't have a lot of space, and honestly, you have a high risk, right? So the ability to monitor and censor is a big deal, and luckily, the cannabis people have done all that research for us. So thanks to them, my farm will benefit when I grow my rice.
Christine, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think I get to be the last question. So in July, Mike and Colleen and I did a presentation here about the moon, and one of the things that we talked about were eating insects on the moon. So how does insects go along with what you're talking about?
You essentially replace the aquatic stage. So the aquatic stage could be replaced with mealworms or other insects. I mean, most people's stomachs go a little weird when I start talking about mealworms. I've eaten them myself. They don't taste totally horrible, right? I've eaten earthworms. Earthworms taste bad.
No.
Grasshoppers, not so bad. Mealworms, not so bad. Earthworms, bad. So anyhow, yes, you would replace essentially the aquatic stage with that. The other thing is you could make an aerobic hydroponic garden that grows funguses like mushrooms or morels. Right, so there's no reason you couldn't use the same hydroponic technologies with less of a root circulation and more of a very slow circulation across. And then instead of adding in CO2, you're actually adding oxygen and extracting CO2 and growing mushrooms. So you could do that. You could also do that with the mealworms. So mealworms can be grown on a media, right? You can stack them are crickets grown in media, essentially media boxes, and you'd have separate boxes. And then you'd, of course, bring in oxygen. You'd send in plant waste. So that's a beautiful use of all the leftover chunks from the rice stalks and everything, right? You feed that to your mealworms, and you have happy mealworms.
And Bryce, do you want to announce your AIAA fellowship? Oh, can we do that?
You can announce it, I guess.
So while Bryce is picking out his coin there, I wanted to point out that Bryce is a new AIAA fellow.
Associate fellow.
Associate fellow, thank you. And so he'll...
Courtesy of her efforts.
And he'll give his award in...
January.
In January. Yeah. So congratulations.
Thank you.
You picture...
Yeah, our coin.